Sorry.
Hello. Can everyone hear me? Can you hear me now? Hi, I'm Julie O'Donoghue. I'm the senior writer at Louisiana Illuminator and the vice president of the Baton Rouge Press Club. My speaker today is the new president of the Public Affairs Research Council of Louisiana, Stephen Procopio. Stephen was nominated in 2021 to this job. Previously, he was the policy director for the organization, and before that, he was the chief of staff of the Louisiana Division of Administration. Stephen's going to talk to us today about PAR's thoughts on the upcoming state budget that's supposed to be released tomorrow, and also the redistricting session that starts on Monday. And I hope you give him a warm welcome.
Julia, thank you so much, and thank y'all for inviting me. One quick note, it's a little cold in here. Y'all might want to charge like an extra $1 or something and then buy some heat. I'm gonna throw that out there. So if I start shaking, it's not because I'm nervous. Let me say, I think PAR has a very symbolic or symbiotic relationship with the media. We do high quality, thoughtful research. It's nonpartisan, because I know the media will get bombarded with people like, run this thing that I'm pushing. And we try, to do what we think is the best of Louisiana. I know we get a lot of interaction from people that are just asking us questions. We're also that watchdog on budget issues, on ethics issues, and I know the media really appreciates that as well. I'm mostly going to talk about the budget, but I want to talk a little bit about redistricting, and I want to start just talking a little bit about the future of PAR and my vision for it. We're still going to do in-depth research. We're still going to do those big, massive administrative documents. How many people here read our 90-page review of the Article 7 of the Constitution? Yeah. So yeah, but I'm still glad we did it. But what we're going to do is up our communication game. We're still going to do those things. Maybe we'll get them down from 90. But we're going to have more shorter, easy to digest documents. So something that people can just kind of read. It's not that bar. We're hoping, aiming in the 2, 3, 4 page. So for example, with redistricting, instead of last time we did a 20-page report on redistricting, we're doing a series of 3 reports that are each going to be 2 to 3 to 4 pages long, so that people can read it in their schedule, read it on their phone, and try to get the same core information out there, but make it a little bit easier. We also have a much more energetic social media presence. We've had accounts, but now we're actually using them at a much higher level. So hopefully those of y'all that follow social media will notice a difference, and we're trying to do more there. I do want to take a second and make sure I acknowledge the reasons that we're doing much better on these things. We have Kaylee right here as our new communication manager, and so she's making sure we get information out to y'all. And of course, Melinda, our new research director, which is make sure we can get all those pieces out as quickly as we really want to. Which really isn't a problem with Melinda. She basically sneezes and she gives me a 4-page report. So it's impressive how much compared to, she makes me look bad as the former person in that spot, which I'm fine with. We're also going to do a lot of initiatives as well. So it's not just the research. We're going to actually do more activities that aren't strictly research. We're going to reach a younger, broader audience. We're going to get young professionals, even college students. We're going to do more on information and education. That's not, so we don't want to have necessarily recommendations in that work. If you're not familiar, we have a Sunshine headquarters, and that's where citizens can go and find out about open meetings laws and their rights as a citizen for public records. And I think a lot of people have used that, a lot of citizens have used that, a lot of the media have used it as well. I want to do something similar with a fiscal headquarters, so we can have budgeting information, the budget process and the tax system. It's a very complicated system. There's no easy one place to get all that information, and so I want to make sure we have that for citizens. The dream is that I have an explanation of the capital outlay process that even a legislator can understand. All right. That may not ever happen, but we'll see. We're going to do webinars. I can't believe during this whole pandemic, PAR has not done a webinar, and so we're going to step up and do that. Speaking of which, then Friday, February 4th at 12:15, we're actually have a webinar on redistricting. So that's going to have Senator Sharon Hewitt and Representative Stefanski, as well as Melinda and myself, and that's going to be the first Friday after the session has started. So we're going to talk about the general issues, but also what's going on and what we're hearing, and we'll hear it from the horse's mouth, because these are the chairs of the committees that have to deal with this. So I think that's going to be very fascinating. I hope we're going to do a lot more in terms of webinars, hopefully once a month. So I encourage y'all to look into that. And then there's a lot of other plans I have in terms of issues, but I'm going to wait until those plans are a little further along. So speaking of redistricting, like I said, we're doing a 3-part series, and the first 2 are out already. Redistricting is a very interesting political issue. I'm borrowing this slightly from Mark Ballard, but redistricting is basically a math problem guided by law. It is, there are things you want to get done, but there are all these degrees of freedom and restrictions on what you can and what you have to do, and so it makes it a very complicated issue. So our first part was just basically an overview, talking about the process, the demographic changes that we've had, the shifts from, for example, from rural to urban areas, and also about the legal and political changes. We now have no requirement for pre-clearance from the Justice Department, which really kind of changes it in very subtle ways that you may not necessarily notice at the citizen level, but it means there's going to be a lot more freedom on the front end. Though we'll see if that's a mixed blessing, because it could be a smoother process in some ways when you had pre-clearance, because you kind of knew that, okay, at least we have some sort of clearance this is going to go through. We also have divided government. You have a governor that may or may not use his veto, depending on how far out of bounds the legislature gets on what his values are. That is very different. And also in our first one had a lot of links and resources to information and tools. This only happens once a year, and technology changes so fast now. It is a difficult issue to follow because it's not just text. But there are so many tools online now of figuring out what's going on, what the proposals are, and making your own proposal. And you get all the shape files and demographics and everything goes with it. I actually had a couple of people give me their maps, just citizens, as well as all the organizations that are out there pushing it. It's really impressive, and I think we've come a long way. Our second issue, on the second part, we talked about the major issues. I think this should be familiar for everyone that's here. Number one is going to be the majority minority districts. Congress will get the most attention. It always gets the most attention, but at Bessie, with the House and Senate, those are all things that people are going to be looking at to see, can we make those more representative maps and make them more representative of the demographics we have here. Also will be the Louisiana Supreme Court. This is a tough one. You need a 2/3 vote, but it hasn't been changed since 1997. It doesn't need to be perfectly apportioned, so says the U.S. Supreme Court, but it's still the idea that these things probably, to make all the voters in those districts have sort of equal representation, that their vote would count as much as anyone else. I think there's a lot of thought that this needs to happen, but it's very difficult to get it done. All right, on the third part will be our recommendations, so we haven't put that out yet. Not surprising, our recommendations are going to be for more transparency in the process, and we'll have some specific ways to do that. But like I said, given all the technology that's available, the tools that are available, it's a lot easier for citizens to follow along, but the legislature has to really make sure they're doing their part to make sure the information's available as they're moving through the process, that citizens know what's going on. I've really been impressed by the citizens and the organizations that have actually gone in and done their own work and submitted maps. I mean, that is impressive. All right, so Thursday is when I hope that part will come out, but tomorrow is the executive budget presentation. In fact, later this afternoon, the governor's going to go over some of the highlights of his budget, and that's what I want to spend the bulk of my time with. All right, so we have a disaster, a budget shortfall, then a budget boom, followed by a fiscal cliff. Does that sound at all familiar? Now, the good news is it's not as bad as it was last time in terms of the fiscal aspect. So let's look at some of the numbers. This year, we have a surplus of almost $700 million that can only spend on certain things. We have an additional $850-ish million to be spent in this year. Then next year, we're going to have an $870 million above what we have now. And then We have about $1.4 billion in federal pandemic aid that lawmakers can sort of appropriate. There's actually several other buckets out there, in terms of broadband and education money. There's a lot of information, a lot of money going out through the state. And then in 2025, 2026, we're going to have about a $370 million shortfall compared to next year's budget. That is a lot less than we've had to deal with post-Katrina. And some of that is because we haven't made the problem worse. We have this temporary taxes that are going to be falling off, and we have some shifts, from the sales tax to the Transportation Trust Fund, but we haven't used a lot of one-time money for recurring expenses. And that's where we got into a lot of trouble before. And so I want to make sure that they get the credit they deserve for doing that. I think they've really learned a lesson about using that short-term money for recurring expenses. They may have forgotten a lesson about special legislative projects and pork, but we'll talk about that at some other time. And mostly have done this by putting money into the infrastructure, a rainy day fund, the unemployment trust fund. There's a lot of things that essentially put money into, and I think that's appropriate how they legislate those dollars. But that's just sort of not doing bad stuff. What about doing good stuff? I think there's a feeling that the legislature and Louisiana in general may blow this opportunity. We have billions coming into the state either through from the feds or increased revenue. And it's not exactly that we would waste the money, although plenty of people are going to think that. I'm sure the money will mostly go to good things, but we will pass the opportunity to transform the state of Louisiana. With this much money, we ought to be able to look back and say, okay, in 3, 5, 10 years, how are we different? How are we improved? We have so much we can improve on. What did we do with this money? Okay, so what should we do? And I have 3 things. It's really like 2.5 things, but I'll explain. The first thing is get a plan. And let me be clear about this. Spending is not a plan. If you're going to say, we're going to put $10 million in X, that's not a plan for the future and how you can improve the state. That's just a budget. Now, you need money to do these things, but in and of itself, it's not enough. You need to say what you want to accomplish. What are you trying to accomplish? So, for example, we can recognize that we have a teacher retention problem. So, look, we want to solve or diminish the teacher retention problem or do better with teacher recruitment. And then you can address that through a pay raise. And it might be, if that's the problem you're trying to solve, there might be 2 or 3 other things you want to do in conjunction with that. And say, look, here's this problem, here's how we're solving it, and a teacher pay raise could be a huge part of that. And monetarily, it probably is. But there are other things you want to do. It changes it from let's just put money at something and hope good stuff happens to what's an issue, this is what we're trying to accomplish, and then it lets voters on the back end say, did we accomplish it? Did that actually happen? And that's the accountability portion. Now, secondly, and this is why it's part 2, is we need to put more money in early childhood education. And this is the only individual thing I'm going to talk about that PAR is recommending that we put more money into. And I say a substantial amount of money. And that's because, just like I was mentioning, we've done a lot of research in this area, and I am convinced that this is I think the number one area that we can really move the needle on so many different issues. Literacy, test scores, graduation rates, job opportunities, healthcare outcomes, public safety. The people that get high quality education years down the road are less likely to end up in jail. So many things. Now, a lot of these are long-term, but it's a lot of long-term things, each backed up with research, peer-reviewed research showing the power of quality early childhood education. But in addition, there's also a short-term benefit because the more children that actually have quality education, early care, that means more parents that are able to go back and participate in the workforce, which we have a problem with now. So it has these amazing long-term benefits, but we have a pretty good short-term reason as well. And I'm thinking along the lines of, I think there's a recommendation that's going to be coming out of the task force of $115 million. That should put around 9,000 kids who will be able to participate that can't afford to right now. So you can see that's really a part 2 to the first one. It is a plan. What are we going to do? What do we want to happen? And it's actually going to move the needle. So I think it's really more an example of 1, but I'll count it as 2. Lastly, we need transparency. Mostly I'm talking about the federal money here, but of course we want to do things with the state money as well. I think we need a web portal that shows a one-stop shop where citizens can see what's going on. And there's plenty of examples from other states. I like Georgia as a prime example of a place that's done real well with this. And some of this is already online. In fact, lots of it's already online. There's places you can go on Louisiana's government websites to find out how we're spending CARES money, the local money. There's the water projects, and you can go to a different place to look at that. And there's the broadband program. There's a lot of information there, but you got to go to the broadband page. Then it's not just the administration, the state treasurer. He's put money about the Main Street grants that he oversaw. The Department of Education has the local education dollars. There's a lot of information out there, but it's scattered in multiple places. And I'm glad they have it out there. But for the citizens to be able to access it, I think there needs to be one spot. People are busy, and we need to make sure they can understand it. But it just doesn't need to be a bunch of links. Okay, there's so many buckets of money. And for each of these buckets, I think we need to describe the program and how much money is available to Louisiana. Okay, look, this is what this money is for, and this is how much money we have. Then what's the plan or criteria? This is what the state's going to use, or this is the criteria we're using to award these projects. And I think a lot of this is already there. It's just a matter of getting it and putting it in citizens' hands. And then there needs to be what's been spent or what's been awarded. Sometimes you would award it. It might take years for that money to actually get spent, but so much is going to this parish to make sure they have water districts or something along those lines. Just list them. In an ideal world, you would make them searchable. So this way there's one comprehensive place where people can find what they're looking for. I think citizens would appreciate this. I think it would make their lives easier. I honestly think it would make the job of the press a lot easier as well. There's information you can go and get. I think even for state government employees it would make it better because they're trying to find all this information as well. So I think that makes a huge difference. And I think these steps, get a plan, put a substantial amount of money in early childhood education, and transparency would really help with the concern that we're going to waste this opportunity. I think there's a lot of good effort going on. I just think it needs to make sure that citizens understand what's going on and that we have a plan and that we're actually going to move the needle with that. Okay, with that, open up to question and answer, which is always my favorite part. I say it's my favorite part, but now Lewis is the question, so I reserve the right to revise my comments. But no.
I got several. You talked about tax collections that repeatedly topped the forecast. Is there some concern that the revenue estimating needs to be tweaked to better forecast the income? Because when you underestimate, you limit the ability to budget the money because of the restrictions of what's over the forecast.
Okay, so, and I'll try and repeat the question as best I can. It's like, is there some concern that we have for predicting what our future revenue is going to be? Because if there's problems, it causes issues either way. Either if it's over or under, it causes problems of stability in the budget. Is that a good summary? Okay. The general concern that you have is absolutely correct. We need to have the REC forecast as accurate as possible. That's the group, the constitutionally empowered group that will say what the forecasts are. What I don't see is necessarily a systematic bias that I can see tweaked. If I could think of one, I would actually agree with you. I have found that REC projections tend to be conservative in the sense they don't change much, that situations on the ground can change a lot faster than REC does. Either way, either revenue accelerates a little faster than they catch up with, or they drop a lot faster. But I don't know that there's an easy way to do that. I've talked to the former person who would predict it was Greg Albrecht for the legislature, and I always sort of brought this issue, like, can we do a better job? He says the problem's not the forecasts, and so he'd bite my head off on that. So I don't know a particular way to make it better. If we can make it better, we definitely want to look at it. Did you have another question?
Yeah.
Okay.
You talked about early childhood education,
right,
which most universities considered a good idea. With the retention problem of teachers, where are you going to get the teachers for the early childhood education?
Well, it's true, and it's a different process for the teachers, and I think there needs a whole point on how you train those teachers as well. And I think increasing capacity for getting more teachers is so we can use some of the temporary federal dollars that we have and making sure that, look, are there better training programs? Are there things that we can do to attract teachers in the short term? But the long term, I think if you have seats in quality daycare and you're actually paying the right amount, and I think Bessie's taken some steps in that amount, then I think you will attract those teachers. Julie?
So I think for the last 12 or 14 months, every time the legislature gets to spend money, they spend a lot of money on pet projects, like tens of billions of dollars going to community centers and pavilions and rec centers and sports complexes, stuff like that. I know Par has commented on this before, but I was wondering if you would want to comment on whether you think that's a good use of the money.
It's almost like we didn't plan this in advance. No, that's not. And look, these sort of pet projects, port projects, if you will, and we actually talk about them in the report that we just released that should be on your desk. That is not a good use of the money. In terms of trying to move the needle, this is not where you want to just sort of distribute out and everyone gets a little bit. Now, let me be clear. Some of these projects, in fact, many of the projects might be good projects. There might be things that if we had an overall plan said, look, we're trying to move the needle on whatever it is, trying to be a better tourist destination, and so we need more pavilions or whatever it is, or we're trying to have healthier kids, so we need more parks. If it's part of a thoughtful process, I'm not saying that these particular projects are bad. But while we've gotten really good at not using one-time money for recurring expenses, we have really backslid on these pork projects. And so, we have to learn to walk and chew gum at the same time and try not to do these things. And so, this is an area definitely of improvement. And I think this is something that people will latch on, maybe even give it, more, attention than it's necessarily due given the amount. But if you're spending billions of dollars and you end up spending tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars on port projects, citizens might forget all about the billions you spent on great stuff like roads and infrastructures and securing the unemployment trust fund. And they're going to focus on these pet projects that they're just going to spend all that stuff. And I think it's going to really undermine citizen trust. And I really hope they can correct that problem. Great. Yeah.
Have you heard anything about a funding plan for the new Mississippi River Bridge in this budget, and what does Mar think would be a good way to go about that?
So have I heard anything about the new Mississippi River bridge in this in the upcoming budget? Surprisingly, the governor's not shared his plans with Par. So I don't know anything particular on the new Mississippi River Bridge. I think there's a lot of issues with that. Money is part of it. Some of it is just sort of the planning and environmental work and prep work that has to go with that. I know that's another giant hurdle that they're going to have to deal with. But I don't have any specific information on that per se. Let's see. Hold on. Let me come up late.
I'm relatively new to covering the budget. This will be my second year covering the budget, but you said that...
You become a veteran really quick in Louisiana. So.
Now that Melinda's on next to me, you said that it was the port projects or the special, projects that
right.
really backslid on that. Was there a period when that was getting more attention and they pulled?
There was a period they didn't do it. There was a period in there they really weren't doing it, for several years, and that's something that's been more recent. Now, prior to that period, yes, they did it as well, and there's different methods that they did it over time, and we can talk about sort of the history on that. But yeah, there was a period that we weren't having special legislative projects, particularly in the appropriations bill, and there's a different argument over whether it's happening in the capital outlay bill, but that's a more complicated process. All right, let me.
Redistricting.
Yes.
Suppose after all this discussion and study and input, we end up with pretty much the same thing as we have now. What's our recourse?
Okay, so it's not going to be exactly the same thing regardless, because they're going to have districts of equal population. So there's going to be shifts. There just has to be. Now, if you're like, roughly it's the same thing with some tweaks, which is what I hear a lot of discussion. That's what a lot of legislators want is, basically let's do the same stuff and just tweak it a little bit. Your recourse, and what I suspect is going to happen regardless of what happens, is there will be, lawsuits. If for example, if they don't have a majority minority districts, I suspect there will be lawsuits. I think people essentially said that. I think if there are, then there might be lawsuits as well. So I think eventually this is going to have to be all sorted out in court. But that doesn't mean we should let our guard down and say, well, it's just going to get sorted out in court. what is that you want to see? What is it the things that are going to make you upset? And right now you need to be contacting your legislators and letting them know your preference in terms of, what do you want for your district? What do you want for the area you're in? What are the things you value as a citizen? And so, there are a lot of ways you can get them very specific examples of what you like, because there's so many tools available online. And we've posted a lot of those in our publications on our parts on redistricting. And there's a lot of really helpful things there. I think, wait, let me come back to Julia. Do you have your hand raised?
Yeah, so the legislative has been emphasizing that they want to spend a lot of the, call it excess money, or the variety of
Right.
money on one-time expenses, transportation, maintenance at higher ed are two that have come
Right.
up. I think the governor's probably going to want to spend a little bit more money on things like teacher pay raises and some recurring expenses. Does PAR have any sort of vision on how they think this largesse of money should be used?
So there may be two things that we're talking about. So there's surplus dollars, which are like when you closed out the previous year, how much money was left over, and constitutionally those can only be spent on certain things. Then there's what's often called, I call it excess dollars, which means an increase in the current year budget that they weren't planning for.
But I want to be clear, I'm not just talking about the excess dollars. I mean,
Yeah.
federal funding is also, in some ways, not something that's going to stick around for
Right.
years. So
Oh, no, yeah, well, then the federal dollars. But then there's also the extra money for next year's budget. And I think there's a lot of discussion about the extra money for this year's budget should probably be used for one-time expenses, like unemployment trust fund, that type of things. Now, in terms of next year's budget, I haven't heard a lot of resistance to spending those on recurring items, because that's the bucket of money you spend on recurring items. Now, maybe some of that should be directed toward one-time things such as paying down debt or other things so you make your life a little easier in the long term. But some of that money is going to and should be spent on recurring items, because that's what that bucket of money is for. And so I would not be at all surprised if it was used for teacher pay raises. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. That's the thing that you would want to use for those type of items, as opposed to the federal dollars or the excess. And they put again, early child education, because that's recurring expense. I want to see more of that as well. So yeah, you can see it for that. You could see it for all kinds of things that would be recurring. That's the bucket of money you need for recurring. And I'd be shocked if it didn't mostly go for recurring items. It would be interesting to see what it wasn't, and I'd have no problem with that. That's what that should be used for, cognizant of the fact that in several years from now, we're going to have a cliff, even if it's a smaller one, so that we either do things that reduce it by paying down debt or not really obligating us by spending on one-time money, or by putting on things that will move the needle so that the economy will grow enough so that hopefully that also reduces it. And you can do that by improving education or improving infrastructure. And so there's other things you can do to really lessen that burden, not just for that shortfall, but also just to make Louisiana better and grow the economy. Does that answer your question? Okay, I think Blake was next, and I'll come.
I was wondering if you could talk about maybe what you think discussions of changing the tax rate, or if with this extra money, you're saying, we shouldn't go back to what happened after Katrina.
Right.
And cut taxes and whatnot sort of thing. Do you think that that's a sort of lawmakers have learned their lesson there, or is this, do you think, I'm trying to get an idea of like maybe what these debates might look like in the upcoming session.
Yeah, I think there are two issues. In the upcoming session, it's a non-fiscal session, so they can in fact cut taxes, but they can't have an overall discussion about taxes and different trade-offs and things like that. I don't necessarily say that cutting taxes in itself is a bad thing. What I want to say is that it should be thoughtful and make sure there's a plan to address it. Instead of just saying, well, we're going to cut taxes and we're going to reduce the deficit, or we're going to reduce the budget by $300 million, but that will be someone else's problem 4 or 5 years from now. It's say, okay, look, we're going to have a plan, and this is how we're going to actually pay for that tax cut. That's where I think some of the problem can be, is you have to be thoughtful about it and actually address it. Now, that being said, I don't see that there will be much that will happen with tax cuts this year. If anything, I think that would probably be next year. But I don't want to necessarily rule it out. It is in fact possible, even in a non-fiscal year like this, to just straight up reduce taxes. They set up the Constitution that way.
Redistricting, yes.
Okay.
You've seen the road shows.
Yeah.
There were about 5 or 6 folks out there with different plans. Any of them that you are kind of eyeing up or liking?
Oh, okay. So no, we are not going to point out to any particular redistricting plan and say, this is the good one, go past this one. What I will say, I think, one, I just like the effort, and I encourage other people to look. If you don't spend the time yourself to figure out how you want to redistrict, at least go look at these alternative plans that are out there. And you can find this in the links to our publications. You can go to the maps that are out there and look, because that will give you a good sense of the things that are possible in terms of do it. And that's not one I particularly like more than any other one. I think there a lot of the biggest ones are efforts to see if we can get more majority minority districts. And I think there ought to be a serious look at that and see, is this possible? Can we do this in the legal strictures? And if they don't do it, they owe everyone an explanation on why they're not doing it. It may just be that you can't, you know, in terms of how it works out, but everyone's looking at this, and this is a major issue, and they need to have a serious review of what's going on.
But just a follow-up to that, you know, I mean, there's so much, I mean, we're moving away from the rural communities. I mean, the numbers like in cattle.
Right.
Have diminished tremendous. And, I mean, a plan that wouldn't include something like that couldn't be anything that you would want.
Oh, yeah, so I think your question is, given all the changes that we had with the move away from the rural districts, any plan that didn't account for that wouldn't work. Is that sort of the question? Yeah, absolutely. And so it's obviously you're going to have to do something about that. And particularly you're going to see in the northern districts, you know, is it going to just essentially migrate south because you're going to need to have larger congressional districts, or is it going to be more districts in the south part of the state? And that's just math. There's no changing that. It's just a matter of how you handle that and all the other disruptions and see, you know, and even if your district was fine, even if your district basically has the same population, but all your other surrounding districts, this one gained seats and this gained population, and these two next to you lost population, you still could get changed around. So I think it's going to be a very dynamic process. It's very hard for the legislators to get their heads around it. I know they're all looking at their seat, but then you have all these other Bessie and Congress to look at it. But what I really want to emphasize is that there's actually a way for citizens to look at this as well. The maps are so much better, and so you can be much more empowered about what's going on, and so that you can have, you know, express your opinion. People like to express their opinions, but I want you to make sure you express your informed opinion. I think that will be much more persuasive to your legislators. Oh, I didn't see you. He's blocking your hand. Okay.
Okay, come February, we're going to have the 144 doing the slicing and dicing. Do you believe that when that happens, that, say, legislators that are term limited or they're approaching term limits are going to have, you know, by nature, so less sway than those who are going to be here possibly longer?
Oh, the ones that are term limited will have less sway? Oh, so in the redistricting process, will term limited legislators have less sway? I don't think that's going to be true. Because usually the term limited ones are the ones with most seniority and are the chairs of the district of the committee. So I don't think that's true. What we have seen in the past, and this is some possibility we see, is sometimes term limited districts, they will be more willing to allow for changes in their district because they can't run anyway. And so it's not like their constituents we're going to get them back. So they might be able to be the most malleable in terms of like, look, I can't run this district anyway. Go ahead and cut this apart if you need to make all the other maps work, because no one can have the same district they have. And sometimes you see with the term limited districts that's what can happen from people trying to be, you know, a team player. On the other side, though, you have people who are term limited that might think about running on the other side, and so they actually might start paying attention, like, okay, I want to run for this Senate seat. Is this going to include where I live now? So you're going to see some of that too. That's not going to be public, but that's definitely going to happen. Lewis? Oh, thank you.
Oh, I was just, I was surprised to learn that in the 70s, Parr actually was charged with drawing the maps by the court. So I was wondering if you think that there's any chance you'll be in that position again this time.
So, yeah, so if y'all don't know that, so because of the breakdown of the redistricting process, then the courts actually just gave it to Parr and to sort of come up with a plan. And I don't know a lot about the details of the process other than I kind of know it. I never had a chance to go back and like, what map did we come up with? I don't want to emphasize it too much. On one hand, it's really kind of cool that Parr was respected this much. On the other hand, then we get blamed for all the problems that happened since 1970. So I got to be careful. Well, I will say this. I don't know particularly that anyone's interested in PAR doing these maps. I do think there is a not an insignificant chance that you will have breakdowns on some of these maps, particularly given some of the difficult issues and the fact that you could have a governor that, if you get past a certain point, he's going to veto things, and a legislature that maybe wants to go there. And so there could be some conflicts between getting an override of a veto. Now, they can handle some of this in a special session. If they don't get all the maps done, they have a little bit more time. But if they can't get it done, and then it goes to the courts, at that point, I don't rule that out as a possibility. Now, whether they give it to us, in some ways, I hope not. I don't know if I need that headache. But it certainly it was a sign of respect for PAR that we've done that in the past.
The federal, the state, and the local governments have had more money than we could have ever imagined.
I can imagine a lot of money, but I get your point. Yeah.
What gives you believe that we will learn to live again with less money?
When do we? Well, in 3 years, we're going to have to do it. I mean, that's about when the money starts to roll off, and in 24, 26. I mean, it's going to happen, and we've learned to live with it before, and we're living with it now. The question is, if the only thing we do is learn to live with less money, then I don't know that we've advanced a whole much. What I want to see is making sure with the money that we do have that we do something significant with it. I think that's really one of the big points I want to have here, not just kind of living with what we have. I mean, we do that. That's fine. That's going to have to happen constitutionally. But really, given all this money that we have, how do we move forward? And so I'm really interested in see what the governor's plan and what the legislature does as well. I want to be really clear. I'm not saying that they won't have a plan. I'm just saying that I hope they do. I'm not saying that they're not going to have transparency. In fact, I think there's a really good chance they're going to try and bring something out along those lines. But that doesn't mean it's not a good recommendation. The party's not going to do it.
We appropriate state and federal money in one instrument, which is almost counterproductive because even if we lowered state taxes and we increased federal money, it would look like we were growing the budget. So what would y'all's opinion be on separate instruments? Would it be more transparent if we appropriated state money in one instrument and federal money in another?
So I see what you're getting at. So is the issue, look, it can be confusing for people, and look, we're spending more money because it's a lot more federal money when we're really reducing state money, if that's the case, and it has been in the past. I don't know about the technical issue of separating a federal budget versus a state budget, and I think that might be difficult in some things like that has both. So for example, healthcare. It's such a mix of both, it might become difficult to do that. That said, PAR always tries to make this clear, and there's lots of people that will, on every side say, oh, look, we're increasing the budget. That's a terrible thing, and it's really a lot of federal money. What PAR needs to do, and what we're going to continue to do, is try to be clear about the issues. So we will point out, no, this is an increase in federal money, not state money. Or it's an increase in state money, but federal money has gone down. So actually it is, whatever the case is, our job at PAR is to make sure the citizens know the facts and then workplace people can go. Because you're absolutely right, people will definitely take whatever budget, in whatever form, whether it's 2 budget bills or multiple budget bills, and apply it to whatever they're trying to push for. Everyone's going to do that. And it's always shocking to me, when I first started getting into budget issues, I thought, if I just see the numbers, I'll know what's going on. But there's so many different ways to interpret the numbers. You're looking at different sources of whether it's federal or state revenue. Or what's your comparison point? Is it last year, the year before? Is it future projections? And so there's just lots of different ways. I don't think we're ever going to get past that, and there's not a technical way to do it. I think that's just really trying to empower citizens to understand what the actual issues are. Oh, wait.
Could you help me with the background of the federal funding for construction of highways? If I understand, 2 years ago, a law was passed to keep DOTD from using those construction dollars for salaries and benefits.
Okay, yeah.
So could you help me with how did that get started 20 years ago? It's $12 billion, I think is what we're talking about.
Well, okay, Well, I think that's maybe a couple. What's going on with the changes that were to DOTD, so that the money has to go to construction rather than, say, employee salaries. And so there's a lot of different things. There's all the federal money that's moving through, but then you also have, there was a constitutional amendment that created a construction sub-fund of the Transportation Trust Fund. So normally it was a trust fund and had, that's where all the money would go into it, and then that could only be spent on the things allowed by the Constitution, which is transportation. But it was also being used to fund the Department of Transportation and Development, which included salaries, and because that's what they worked on. But I think partially in an effort to provide more trust and to get people ready to look, if we ever increase taxes on transportation, it's going to go to construction. And I think that was a precursor to that. They created a transportation construction sub-fund. And so money that goes in that, any new money has to go into that, can only be used on construction. And then the other pot of money before that can be used on other things like salaries. So that's sort of how it's been handled. But that's relatively recent. That's not like 20 years old. Is that helpful? Okay. And that'd be good if we put out that fiscal headquarters, and then you can get those questions answered there, too. Yeah.
I think that's probably it. We've taken a lot of students' time.
Thank you all so much. I really appreciate this. If you have any other questions, just email me or contact me.